Hello. Okay, so today I'm gonna be doing another screencast on for world geography, and I'm doing North Africa and the Middle East. And the main reason I'm doing this is because I don't entirely agree with the way that the book organizes this particular section, and so I'm gonna give you a brief overview myself, and then we're gonna do a couple of current events things later on in the unit. What we need to understand first is I don't want to pigeonhole the region. And I understand that there's like a lot of assumptions that people have about the Middle East, and I hopefully during this segment we can help break some of them down. But I would like to go ahead and start off by explaining that the Middle East is divided predominantly along religious lines. Okay. Um, this is There are two major denominations of Islam. So to make this something that you're more familiar with, if you're familiar with Christianity and the way that Christianity is organized here in the United States, you have Catholics which if you'll remember from our introduction to world religion earlier in the semester, Catholicism is sort of like the originator of most forms of Christianity. So you have Catholics, and then you have basically everyone else. There's a little bit of an exception with Eastern Orthodoxy, but for simplicity's sake, we are going to acknowledge that predominantly in the United States, people are either Catholic or they are Protestant. Um, Protestants are the denominations that are created after the Protestant Reformation, which you'll learn more about next semester. Islam is similar to this. Islam was one unified religion when it was originated back in around 600 AD. So it was one unified religion, and then after Muhammad, the prophet who founded Islam, passed away, there was a political division within Islam along tribal lines. And what ended up happening is you have Islam that splits into two different denominations. Sunni Islam, which is the more prevalent of the two, and Shia Islam. Sunni Islam holds central to it this belief that there is a central authority that controls Islam, known as the Caliph. And the Caliph is descended from Muhammad, the political leader of the Islamic Empire and the Ottoman Empire later on. And then Shia Islam is the other sort of smaller denomination of Islam that doesn't hold that there's a central authority any longer, but that interpretation of the Word of God is controlled through imams, which are essentially religious leaders that are chosen by God, and oftentimes they're chosen by previous imams. So imams exist both in Sunni and Shia Islam. In Sunni Islam, they're predominantly prayer leaders. So, basically, they'd be like pastors or priests in Christianity. In Shia Islam, they're more significant than that. They have a sort of like divine authority because it's believed that they are chosen by God. So the concept is a lot more complicated in Shia, but for the purposes of this class, all we need to know is that there are these two denominations and that they are split. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a couple of maps. The first map that I'm going to include, and this is how we're going to start talking about the Middle East, is the map of the divisions of the Middle East immediately following World War I. So essentially, what happened is from 600 some odd AD to 1918, the Middle East was one single unified polity. There was one state that was in charge of most parts of the Middle East and oversaw it. It was originally the Islamic Empire, and then the Islamic Empire gave way to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was based out of Turkey. Following World War I in 1918, the Ottoman Empire dissolved, and it was chopped up by France and Britain. So what ends up happening is you have independent Turkey, which is where the Ottoman Empire was previously based. You have independent Turkey, which is right here. You have Syria and Lebanon, which are both sort of French-controlled territories. So even though they're controlled by the local population, they're under the sphere of influence of the French. And then you have Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, which are controlled by Britain. Egypt is down here because Egypt is technically independent at this time, but they have a considerable amount of British influence. But Egypt will continue and become independent into very quickly in the 20th century. Excuse me. Okay, so this is a map of how the way that the Middle East was divided immediately after World War I. These divisions were made predominantly for the political powers that were dividing them, Britain and France, to maintain control over things that they wanted in the region. The Middle East is a very important region in the global economy because it has access to lots of oil, and because it is sort of in between this idea of the West, or Europe, bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and the East, Asia, where on the far end it borders the Indian Ocean. Okay, so what ends up happening is Britain takes control over this segment here, and France takes control over this segment here, and they paid absolutely no attention to any sort of existing ethnic concepts that were here. So around here, this region of Syria and Iraq is populated by a group of people known as the Kurds that are not ethnically Arab. They don't speak Arabic, and they are not ethnically related to the majority of the rest of the population of the Middle East, which is ethnically Arab, meaning they come from Arabia. This is the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so I'm going to transition to a map of today so that we can get a better idea of what this looks like. You can see that many of these countries are still in place. Here's Syria still, Lebanon, Palestine later becomes Israel. Here's Jordan, and here's Iraq. These countries stay in place, and they're created this way because of the influences of France and Britain, and the reasons that, or the motives of France and Britain at the time. So, for example, Lebanon is a country that was created by France as a place for all Arab Christians to live. So it was initially created with the idea that there was a large Arab Christian population, and France wanted to protect them, so they created their own country. This would later lead to significant religious tension and a really, really odd parliamentary system where religious representation is like written into their constitution. Syria and Iraq were created and given to the descendants of this of an Arab leader, and were given to these people without really any sort of consent of the people that they were governing. So they created these countries, and they sent in people that were from here to govern people from here, and the people from here didn't really like it because they had different sort of tribal identities. These sort of tensions still exist. Today, even though these state boundaries still exist, and we like to think of Iraq as being a country and Syria as being a country and Afghanistan being a country, what ends up actually happening is these places have a variety of different sort of tribal identities with people of different ethnicities. Like I said, the Kurds up here, and various religious identities. So, for example, in Iraq, you've got people who identify as both Sunni and as Shia. And that's where a lot of the conflict comes from today, because these countries were sort of forced upon the populations of these regions without sort of any consent. I do want to talk about Saudi Arabia briefly. Saudi Arabia is probably the most wealthy and powerful nation in the region. They were the control of this particular country was given by Britain to the Saudi family, which are an Arab dynasty, and they have basically been the monarchs that have controlled the country since the end of the 20th, or the beginning of the 20th century. So what you have here is a lot of control of indigenous Middle Eastern populations, most of which are ethnically Arab, being decided by people from outside the Middle East. And this is where a lot of the political tension that exists there today comes from. Okay, another really, really key thing for understanding sort of the conflict in the Middle East and the way the Middle East it runs is that Israel was created immediately after World War II as a homeland for the Jewish population of the world. And it was created by Britain, and Britain had promised the Jews that they would have a Jewish state back in the 1920s with this document called the Balfour Agreement. And they didn't end up getting it to them until after the Holocaust happened, and people were like, well, we probably should give these people a country so that no one massacres them again, which is a really reasonable thing to do. Obviously, violence and genocide are absolutely terrible, and we would want to do whatever we can to avoid them. Part of the problem, however, is that there were already people living in what was called Palestine, and they were ethnically Arab, and they were religiously Muslim, mostly. Some of them were Christian, and they identified as Palestinians. Okay, so you end up creating this country, Israel, and you say that it's a Jewish state, but you already have Arab, Muslims, and Christians living there. This ends up creating a considerable amount of conflict between the population that was already living there, the population that moved in, so the Jewish people from Europe, and also Arab Jews, because there are ethnically Arab Jews, and the surrounding countries. And so that is the center of contention for many of the countries that exist, in particular Iran. And I want to talk about Iran, and I haven't talked about Iran yet, because what we need to understand is when we're talking about divisions in the Middle East, even during the time of the Islamic Empire and the Ottoman Empire, Iran, which is not ethnically Arab, so they do not speak Arabic, they do not consider themselves Arab. Iran exists as a stronghold for Shia Islam in the Middle East. Okay, so over here you've got the Ottoman Empire that's running things, and they are Sunni. They have a caliph. They are controlled by the caliph, and then you have Iran, which is controlled by today ayatollahs, who are supremely powerful prophets, or not prophets, excuse me, supremely powerful preachers, essentially, like really, really powerful religious figures. So here is Sunni, here is Shia, and that is one of the major religious divisions of the region. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on is that Afghanistan is, in this particular map, considered part of the Middle East. We are not going to deal with Afghanistan as part of the Middle East. Within contemporary discourse, news anchors, reporters, politicians talk about Afghanistan as if though it is part of the Middle East. It is not really part of the Middle East. The people there are not Arabic. They do not identify with the ethnically with the people from this region. It does not have the same natural resources that make this region so contentious. And it also does not have the levels of development. It didn't have British involvement in the way that the rest of the Middle East did. It is really part of Southern Asia. However, because we are currently at war there, and because there is a prevalence of fundamentalist Islam that has caused conflict with the United States, we treat it as part of the Middle East, but I think that is really simplifying the matter unnecessarily. And so for the purposes of this class, we are not considering Afghanistan part of the Middle East. Okay. This is the map of what we can really consider the Middle East and what we're going to be dealing with within the context of the Middle East. Ending at Iran, and going to Egypt. There are parts of North Africa that you've already read about in the book that are also included, but we'll talk about those separately. The last thing I want you to do is I want you to take down this list of countries, and I want you to write them down, and I want you to learn them. There's going to be an activity coming up. I'm going to have it so that you label these on a map. And I'm also going to see if you can't identify their, I'm going to essentially have you label them on the map. That's what you primarily need to worry about. Okay, that is an overview of the Middle East. We'll be talking more culturally about the Middle East as time goes on, but that is what I sort of wanted to get you started off with today. Okay, thank you very much.